name is Robert Darling. I have been in theater since the late 50s. I'm a designer and I'm a director.
And tell me about your relationship with Henry Mollicone.
Ah, Henry. The first time I met Henry was at Central City. And he had promoted a new opera called The Face on the Barroom Floor, based on the poem, based on the story. And it was an outline that he sent me for this grand three-act opera. It was my first season at Central City. It was the 100th anniversary of the Central City Opera House. And I'd known of Central City for ages and ages and had admired Donald Owenslager, who did the wonderful designer who did the Ballad of Baby Doe, and also Robert Edmund Jones, who really revolutionized the idea of theater and theater design in the 1920s. And Robert Edmund Jones was the first artistic director of Central City Opera. So when I became the artistic director of Central City Opera, it was like this grand mantle of this hero of mine had suddenly appeared. And it was my first season, and I wanted the board of directors to know that I was more interested in live composers than dead ones. And somehow we were going to do that. And the first season, I wanted very much to have a world premiere. So here comes Henry. And he has this outline for a grand three-act opera. And I said, Henry, you know, we can't afford it. We can't put this on the Opera House stage and afford it. The board won't pay for it. They already think I'm crazy. You know, what can we say? And so we thought, and I said, Henry, I want you to come with me. And we got out of the Opera House, and we walked down the street to the Face Bar. And I said, look, this is it. And he said, yeah, I know. And I said, why don't we just do it in here? And he just became crestfallen. And he said, oh my God, my grand opera in a bar. What do we do? I said, yeah, let's do it in the bar. Why not? And Henry went back and with John Bowman, the librettist, and they wrestled with this darn thing. And they tried to figure out what in the world are we going to do. And they came up with the most perfect solution for this commission possible. And as you know, for, oh my goodness, 30, 40 years, Face on the Barroom Floor was the most popular American opera and most produced American opera going. And what Henry did, and John Bowman did, was to figure out how the context of Central City, what it is, where it is, the fact that there are these sensational singers that come there of a summer, provide a framework in Face, and then there's this silly story of the bar. And one of my dear friends, and anyway, so we did it. We did it in the bar. We would do dress rehearsals in the bar, and we wouldn't sell any tickets. We would just, you know, the people would, whoever was in there swilling down a drink, and there was a little honky-tonk piano player in the corner, and Henry very beautifully scored it to start with another little honky-tonk-esque piano, which we had set up at the other end of the bar. So the honky-tonk piano player takes a break, the other piano player starts up a cello and a flute, and we're into it. And the folks sitting in the bar, you know, would sort of acknowledge the other piano player, but not really, as they were sitting there with their beer or whatever it was. You know, it was great. It was absolutely great. And then these singers entered from the street, talking very loudly. And there's a cue in there where John has the Violetta, the guy from New York who's come out to visit his friend in the Central City, said, oh, you're my Violetta, you're my star. And she breaks into that little quote from Sempre Liber at the beginning. And after that, we're all in it. And you can see these people who had never seen an opera, heard an opera, and they think, oh my God, what have we done? You know, he came in here for a lovely drink, and now what of it? What's going on? And then they would sit there and they would watch this thing, and they would hear this thing, and then they would be drawn into it, and you could just see the magic of the opera taking over them, you know, in their body language and everything else, as they would suddenly know that this was something else. And the story would go on, and it goes back in time, a little flashback, 100 years. We were all into the story. And the way I staged it in the bar, she gets up on the bar and she sings her little aria on the bar. And what Henry and John did was that they did all of the things you can do in opera. You know, little arias, little wonderful trios, two wonderful trios in that piece, and duets, and everything that you do in a long evening in the opera is done in that little miniature half-hour piece. Wonderful. And we did one dress rehearsal, and the first time the woman that gets killed, as you know, alas, and there was some woman from Iowa who was in there, and she had just got drawn into it. When the gun went off, she went like this, and all the drinks, everything else, all over the floor. It was just terrible. It was just terrible. But that's what opera should do. That's what opera wants to do. It wants to tell a story, so compelling a story, that you cannot remove your attention from it. And when you're in that small little place, the bar in Central City, or even the fabulous little opera house in Central City, you are in such proximity to the energy of the great singers that you are drawn in. The great power of music theater is irrevocable there. So that was my first meeting with Henry, was over Face, and convincing him that his 3-act opera on the Opera House stage would be infinitely better as a half-hour opera in the bar itself. And the whole time I was there, we did performances in the bar. I understand now they don't do that as much, which is whatever.
But your history with Henry went beyond.
Well, with the great success of Face, and that first season I also had Kurt Herbert Adler, who was the wonderful director of the San Francisco Opera, and he said, you know, Bob, this Henry is talented, I think. What do you think? I said, yeah, sure, absolutely, you know, Adler, you should commission him. And so Adler had several balls that he was tossing up in the air at once, and I had done a lot of work with Adler in terms of reinventing what San Francisco Opera did. We designed Western Opera Theater for him. It was my first project with Adler, was Western Opera Theater. And then we did, San Francisco Opera had been doing this sort of on the cheap spring productions. The big season was in the fall, and they would do the spring opera productions in the spring with young singers. And we convinced Adler that those performances would be infinitely better in one of the legitimate houses downtown San Francisco. And so we moved it out of the Opera House, which is too big for what they were really doing and what the casts were that were really doing. And it was ideal for these wonderful small, in that small venue. And Adler wanted something that he could do in the streets. And he had this idea that he called brown bag opera. And he thought, well, you know, here's my friend Bob Darling, and they do this thing in the bar. We just do a new opera for San Francisco. And he lit on the idea of Emperor Norton. And Emperor Norton was, of course, a street person in San Francisco and a great legend of his own, and a wonderful guy. And Henry came up with this charming little opera on Emperor Norton that's been quite a success, and it's done quite regularly, especially in San Francisco. It's a genre that I would call occasional operas. Face is in some ways an occasional opera. Emperor Norton is also that kind of thing. And from Emperor Norton and his work with Henry, it became apparent to me that we had to get Henry to think in a slightly larger architecture or design for a piece of music theater. He had another one-act opera that was called Lilith, and I had founded a small little company down in Carmel Valley, which is where I'm doing the Bohème next month, and they too were a little occasional space, and they too wanted, and I wanted them to work with composers so that we could get pieces that would be viable. So Henry came down there with Judy Fine, his librettist of the Lilith piece, and I said, Henry, why don't we reinvent this as a three-act opera? The reverse of what we did on Face, and out of that came Hotel Eden, in the Lilith, there's this little chorus of the three angels that say, "Welcome to the Hotel Eden." And I thought, that's the perfect name for this piece.
Tell me about Hotel Eden.
Hotel Eden. So this notion of working closely with composers I was able to carry out in Central City. And in fact, there were several seasons where we did have more live composers than dead ones on the rep. And in the little company that I had created, founded with Randy Bear and Peter Meckel in Carmel Valley, we were able to shepherd into being several little operas. And the first one that I thought we really needed to try was to see how we could nurture Henry into writing a larger scale work. And out of that came Hotel Eden. And we did several workshops, wonderful workshops, in which we tested the second act and we tested the third act, and we unhappily ran out of money and couldn't do the premiere. So the premiere for Hotel Eden was done by San Jose Opera. And they did a quite good job. I am still chomping at the bit to do a production of Hotel Eden. It's a charming work. In fact, I in some touch with Judy Fine. Judith, the librettist, at the time would not dare set foot in an airplane, and so she would drive everywhere. And then she moved from L.A. to Santa Fe, and then they came up to Carmel Valley. Now she's a sensational travel writer. She has a wonderful blog and travel thing called Life is a Trip. She's good, and has promoted some of the wonderful kind of attitude and interest that she has, that she had in Hotel Eden, appears in her blogs. But Hotel Eden is this wonderful little three-act piece which looks at couples and coupling. There's the middle-aged couple, there's the young couple, and then there's the elderly couple. And the young couple is Adam and Eve, and the other woman is Lilith. And the middle-aged couple is Admiral Noah and his wife, and he has just been released from Betty Ford's for his drinking problem. And they check into the hotel on New Year's Eve. And then the elderly couple, and the hotel and the music Henry has contrived for it is wonderful. It's like a Palm Beach hotel. And the elderly couple is Sarah and Abraham. And the other woman is Hagar. And we move through all of those seminal issues in that great story. And Henry has put into both of those acts wonderful ensembles. He's a brilliant writer of ensembles. In the story of Admiral Noah and Mrs. Noah, she has a great sort of Ethel Merman song about why do they always call me Mrs. Noah, you know, and she talks about being in Samoa and whatever. Wonderful, wonderful, giddy, silly song. It says, and still I'm Mrs. Noah, my real name. Oh, my real name. And she comes up and says, my real name. I've forgotten. Oh, dear. Abraham and Sarah's story begins with, you know, they're sitting sort of getting up in the morning in this Palm Beach hotel experience, and Hagar is urging them on to have some non-fat yogurt and whole wheat bread and whatever it is, And Sarah has been ill. She doesn't know why she's been ill. And she suddenly realizes that she picks up the mirror and she sees how old she's become. And she tells us that, God had told Abraham that he was going to have all of these descendants, and so I fixed it up with Hagar. And I knew, what Henry has written for Sarah is an aria that is the equal to the Marschallin's aria in Rosenkavalier. Now, in Rosenkavalier, the Marschallin is this young woman, of course. She's in her 30s or 40s. She's maybe going to be 40. And Sarah, as we know, is an ancient lady. And Henry has put all of this information into this wonderful, wonderful aria. And Abraham listens to it, and he knows how painful it is for her, and says, "It's okay, Sarah, for God's sake, don't, I love you." And they have a small little duet, and she still doesn't know what's the matter with her. There's a knock at the door, and it's the three angels, of course, as there were in all three other acts. There are three people at the hotel. This time it's the doctor and some nurses, and they come in, and they say to Abraham, and they say to Sarah, says, "There's nothing wrong with you, hon. You're in the family way." It's the family way, the family. And they do that wonderful. But Henry does a little kind of play on that marvelous scene in Act 2, Figaro, in which they find out that Bartolo was the father and Marcellina was the mother. And anyway, so they do this, and Sarah realizes that she's going to have a baby. And like the great announcement that happens to her in the Genesis story, Sarah and Abraham said, "Well, what do we do now?" And the rest of the act is all about Sarah, and 9 months passes, and the baby is born, and at the very end of it, she has the little baby Isaac, and she looks up at Hagar, and Hagar is saying, "What's going to happen to my child Ishmael now? What's going to happen?" And there's this very amazing moment that was the result of one of our Hidden Valley workshops. We did a workshop, and we always ask the audience, "Well, what do you think of this?" Blah, 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 blah. And this woman stood up and she said, "You Americans, it's terrific, but I lived in Egypt, and I lived, and you have no idea of the gravity of this story, and what happens with Sarah and Hagar and Isaac and Ishmael and the whole generational hoo-ha." And we, of course, have written this slightly irreverent on purpose, but also serious little epic here. And we were talking dramaturg a few minutes ago, and so we both all sat back, Judy and Henry and I, and we said, "What are we missing?" And what we were missing was a little Luftpause, a little breath, where Sarah and Hagar have to look at one another, and I think Hagar says, "Will our children learn to play together?" And of course, you don't know. You don't know. And that's where music theater leverages our emotions and our thoughts in a very important way.
That's extraordinary. Question for you: Why, given what's being put on Broadway these days, and I did not know this, but I grew up during it. But I grew up when I was a child where Giancarlo Menotti had operas on Broadway, and now we have Andrew Lloyd Webber, who had and basically I don't think Henry's any different than Andrew Lloyd Webber except for one thing: he writes better music. I mean, do you understand that? I mean, Sweeney Todd is an opera. I mean, it's just because
Passion is an opera. Sweeney
yes.
Todd, Into the Park, surely.
Sure. These are opera. I just think that I can't understand. Henry does this thing. I think you know about that. He can take anybody's phone number or birth date and turn it into a song. Have you ever seen him do that? It's a parlor trick, and it's great. But you know something? But because he's a great pianist and he's a great composer, he's able to write things that really will knock your guts out. And after the second time you hear them, maybe not so much, but the fact is he's able to do that off the top of his head and get that effect initially is really quite stunning.
Yeah.
And that's what pop music is really all about. It's the initial effect that's the most important thing.
Interesting. That's interesting.
And he's very frustrated about where he is right now in his career and in his art. He's just, and I don't blame him. If I wrote like that and wasn't a millionaire, I'd be really pissed off too. And I'm just, it's just find it strange that how to get from A to B.
It is frustrating because I think we have stumbled over the Italian word a little bit. And I prefer music theater. I mean, I work with the Alliance for New Music Theater in Washington, and I know Wesley Balk, an old friend and colleague in Minnesota, also believed that the notion of music theater may be better than musical theater, whatever it is, than opera, because there's so much baggage. But when my debut at San Francisco Opera was Le Désir d'Amore, and I had just done a lot of work in New York and on Broadway and off Broadway and tra-la-la. And when I started wrestling with this, I realized, well, come on, darling, this is the musical comedy hit of 1838. You know, that's what you have to look at it. And indeed, it's right. You know, it's absolutely true. And so you produce it as if it were a musical, and you go from this scene to that scene, and all the technical whiz-bang that we can do in New York and on Broadway, and why that's such a valuable place to be. And I think we missed that opportunity. Stephen Sondheim and I were lucky enough to be on a panel for the National Endowment for the Arts. And it was at a period where my former wife, Ann Ferris, was working as the head of Opera America. And then she moved from there into the endowment. And Stephen wanted, and Hal Prince both thought, and Kurt Adler of San Francisco Opera, thought that there's got to be a way to link these genres that will be meaningful. And they had tried it with Giancarlo in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And they worked quite well. I mean, Consul works wonderfully, I think, and was successful. I think St. at Bleecker Street is a wonderful piece and works that way too.
Help the Globalings is on Broadway.
Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, it was.
So I think it has now become such an expensive enterprise because of the influence of all kinds of forces. But at the endowment, Stephen said, "How do you guys do this in opera? You know, you take a piece and you try it out, and you do little workshops like we did with the Hotel Eden. How do you do this?" And I says, Stephen says, I want to see it. I want to take it to New Haven, and I want to see everything, and all the bells and whistles and blah, blah, blah. Otherwise, I don't know what I have. What the NEA was doing didn't have anything to do with giving grants and giving money. Of course, they were doing that. But it linked artists across the whole bloody country, so that someone like myself would be able to sit next to Stephen Sondheim, and we'd be able to schmooze and say, what are we doing? When I was at Central, we brought Charles Strauss out to Central City and ensconced him in one of our old falling down the hill houses, and Henry and other people. And Charles was wanting to try out his Nightingale, his little opera music theater piece. And I think that the collegiality of the environment enabled us to bring those composers together so that they could, in fact, schmooze with the singers, work on the pieces, look at the mountains, look at the environmental detritus of the last century, which is Central City, all those mine tailings everywhere you look. And it is possible then to suddenly paste it together and come up with something new. The next thing I knew after our panel meetings is Stephen had announced Sunday in the Park with George. It wasn't being tried out with all bells and whistles in New Haven. It was going down 42nd Street about 3 blocks and being tried out and workshopped. It's exactly what needed to be done. They've tried all kinds of ways to deal with this. And one of the reasons I think Face is such a success is that I'm going to do this opera and it's going to be performed in a bar. You know, Henry did not have the onus of, we are doing this opera, it's going to be opening at the Metropolitan Opera. Can you imagine that?
Well, I can imagine.
Verdi was able to somehow deal with that, and Wagner was able to sort of triumph over it because of triumph of will or whatever, you know. He didn't feel the onus of it, but I thought about the commission of Antony and Cleopatra. Good grief. I was assisting Franco Zeffirelli on that production. I had been assisting Wieland Wagner on his Tannhäuser, Lohengrin. And then the Met hauled me back from Europe, and I didn't know how I was going to get into the opera house unless I enlisted in Anthony's Legions as one of the super. This is a very long story. I shouldn't go into it.
Oh, now you have
to. Anyway, the point of the story is I was doing so I was assisting Franco on Antony and Cleopatra, which, you know, the opening night was one of the great stories and disasters of all time. And we had gone through, I'm not going to go into that story, it's just too long. Anyway.
You think I might use it? That's fine.
I recorded that for the Library of Congress.
Oh, good. Oh, okay, so it is.
I had the experience of Antony and Cleopatra. And I was doing a production of The Consul, with Giancarlo staging it for San Francisco Opera. And Adler said, you know, Bob, you go out and you meet with Giancarlo, you talk about this thing. And so I flew to New York, and I figured out how to take the train up to Mount Kisco, and it was on a Sunday. And of a Sunday, Giancarlo and the whole crew would have these brunches. You know, I knew none of this, but anyway, so I landed in the middle of this brunch for what I thought was going to be a production meeting, and was in fact a fabulous cocktail party and what have you. And Sam Barber was there, and I admired him enormously, and had felt that Antony and Cleopatra was sabotaged by Franco Zeffirelli. I mean, I felt that Franco had over-designed it. It was crazy, and it was an interesting idea, but it was, you know, Franco was trying to outdo, Tommy Bussinger was trying to outdo, Bob O'Hearn was trying to outdo every one of those new productions. In any case, I said to Barber, I had this little funny brunch. I said, you know, Sam, Mr. Barber, I said, I think Antony and Cleopatra is a sensational piece. And I think what happens in the end of it, in that wonderful ballet that was staged brilliantly, it's got to be revisited. The pain of that premiere was still so great that he couldn't even talk to this, you know, upstart kid about it at all. And a couple of years later, also at Hidden Valley, where we were doing the Hotel Eden work, we were doing Barber's little Hand of Bridge. And true to the tradition of Face on the Barroom Floor, we were doing a fundraiser at a fabulous Pebble Beach house that had a little musicians gallery, so we could put the 12 musicians for Hand of Bridge in the gallery. And the young singers were all around at the little cocktail party, you know, with their drinks and schlepping around. It was great. And at one point, the soprano was supposed to flick back a little lock of her hair. And they had set up a bridge table in the course of this cocktail party, and people would say, one of these young kids, they just have no manners. Now, what are they doing? And they would put up the bridge table, and they put up the chairs, and they arranged the nuts and all that stuff, and they dealt the cards. And then the soprano did a little thing, and there's that wonderful little clarinet wazza, and we were into Hand of Bridge. And just like Henry in Face, Barber does everything opera can do, little arias, little duets, wonderful little ensembles. And he covers the ground. Time stops in the one aria where the mezzo is saying, "Do not die, mother, do not die." I mean, it's a beautiful little piece. It's an occasional opera. And of course it was sensational in this wonderful Pebble Beach home with the ocean out there and the sun and everything else. And Barbara came up to me and we talked about how important it was to have that kind of music theater experience with those wonderful people in such close proximity, you know. I mean, it's terrific. It's terrific.
I have a question for you. You said something that you passed by very quickly, and I'd like you to explain what you mean by it. You said the Italian thing when talking about why Henry isn't perhaps where Henry should be. And what is the Italian thing?
I just meant the word opera. The plural.
Not the fact, not that Henry is Italian. That doesn't stop him. You don't think? Okay, here we go.
Henry's not Italian. He's an American. He's a Californian, for heaven's sake.
See, if you don't eat like an Italian, you eat Italian.
Well, this is
if he doesn't have cholesterol and heartburn, he's not an Italian. It's like Buddy Hackett said when he went to the army, he started eating army food for the first time when he was eating his mother's food up until then. He said I thought I was terribly sick because I didn't have heartburn. All right, Hi, here are some Robert Darling questions. The general topic is durability then versus now. So the first question is, the poem, why did it capture the imagination of the public when the poem first came out? Why does it now seem a bit out of date? Is its story too simple? Its rhyme schemes too doggerel? So basically he wants to know the charm of the poem, The Face on the Barroom Floor.
Well, in the Alaskan gold rush, not Darcy, but Service and what have you, wrote these sensational little poems. My great-grandmother was a poet and a newspaper reporter in the 1890s in San Francisco, and she took up with Joaquin Miller, who was a poet of some renown in there. And there was this sense of that poetry was elevated speech that could make things work. And, you know, we've been talking about music theater. When elevated speech moves into song, it grabs you. And I think that a poem like Face on the Barroom Floor was an epic story, had perhaps more substance to it than sometimes, but not necessarily. Our rap poems of today have some qualities like that I think are interesting, because the language, I mean, goodness heavens, English is such an interesting and extraordinary language. And so the poem does that. Now, do you know the story of Central City's Face on the Barroom Floor? When Central City, I should begin this one. Well, Central City, the great story of Central City is that two fabulous women in the depths of the Depression in 1931, decided that they should do an opera festival. Can you imagine? And Ida Cruz McFarland was this language teacher at the University of Denver and drama teacher at the University of Denver. Her granduncle, something like that, McFarland had built the Opera House. He'd been the contractor for those sensational Cornish and Welsh miners who decided that they couldn't live without an opera house to do their stuff. And so McFarland had built it at the behest of the community, which in itself is a rather remarkable story. The Cornish and Welsh miners in 1877, 76 and 77 would do amateur theatricals at a place called the Belvedere. Belvedere was, I think it's still there, maybe have slot machines in it now, but Belvedere had a little funny stage at one end, and they decided in 1877 that they would do a performance of Balfe's The Bohemian Girl. Hit tune from The Bohemian Girl is I Dreamt I Dwelt in Marble Halls. And when I first went to Central, I decided, well, we should revive The Bohemian Girl. It was considered one of the English Ring, three operas that were that were performed as if they were a ring, and they were very popular, and they had a very great sense of language and what they were. In any case, as a result of that performance of the Bohemian Girl, the miners thought, we've got to have a proper place to do these performances, because we're pretty good at them. And so they subscripted amongst themselves and the townspeople $40,000 with which to build a proper opera house. And Mr. McFarland built this proper opera house, and they brought in this sensational painter, scenic artist from San Francisco, to do the frescoes and to ornament it so it would be like a proper opera house. And they built a building that has sensational acoustics, by the by. In any case, in 1930, at the depths of the Depression, this sensational opera house, after having had Charles Dickens and all kinds of other people on its stage, was now being used in the main floor to stable cows, and in the balcony to hold the county records and something else. So Ida Cruz decides, this is wrong. My dear great-grandfather, my dear granduncle, whatever, would be horrified that this is what's happened to his opera house in only whatever it was, 60 years or something. So she got a hold of Ann Evans. Ann Evans was the daughter of the second territorial governor of Colorado, and was of the collection of people in Denver that were the movers and shakers. And so Ann Evans and Ida Cruz McFarland traipsed up to the mountains and looked at this building and decided, yes, next summer they were going to have an opera festival. And they did. You know, they put it together. The last train from Denver that went up the mountains to Central City happened for the opera festival. Depths of the Depression. It was broadcast. It was Camille with Lillian Gish in the title role, if you can imagine it, with Robert Edmund Jones as the artistic director, this great Broadway designer producer. And the next year, the Teller House was being sold for back taxes, $5,000. And Anne said, we've got to get a hold of the hotel. And so they did. For the $5,000, they bought the Teller House, this grand hotel, for song. And it happened to have a bar in it. And during the festival that year, I think they were doing Othello, perhaps. And they were carousing in the bar, and the assistant designer to Robert Edmund Jones was a guy by the name of Pancho Gates. And Pancho and some guys were having a merry time in the bar. And there was a bet, and there was this, that, and the other thing. And Pancho said, yeah, the face of the barroom floor. And so in his cups, Pancho went down there and painted this picture of this woman, Madeline, that is characterized in the poem. And then everybody would, the next day he was going to go down and wash it off. And Ann Evans said, no, Pancho, no, keep it there. It'll be something to look at. And sure enough, like the poem, it took off. Pancho, when we did the premiere in 1978, Pancho was mortified. He said, no, you're going to, oh no, you can't. I did that as a joke. Oh my, you can't do this. And poor dear Pancho, he would not go in and face it and look at it or see how his joke painting. And if you look at the painting in the Teller House bar, it is of course a perfect 1920s woman, perfect. It's not the period of the poem. But why does that matter? And of course, which is which and which is what. And what Henry has done in the opera is create another layer of myth onto this whole thing. So when you talk about what lasts, we're touching We're touching the verities here. We're touching important ideas. And the notion of friendship, which is at the core of the opera version of Face on the Barroom Floor. The notion of Pancho joking, you know, that a woman would lure you on, and, you know, he would do this. Why not? Is very, very interesting in how something as simple, seemingly simple, touches you. And I think that when you hear the trio Henry has written at the center of that piece, if you don't get the hair on the back of your neck standing up because it's so exquisite, if you see it in situ, which is why I'm sorry that they don't do it in situ, because it's that historical vibration of this ersatz painting on the floor that also is touching this real idea of the face bar and the face poem and the face opera. It's sensational.
That is. You know why it's not done on the... It was explained to me why it wasn't done. It stopped being done in bar because... Wait, you thought this up. Your idea about how to paint the paint on the floor is put sand down of the same color as the floor, and then as the artist starts to paint it with his brush, he's revealing the painting, correct?
Well,
after 3 years, supposedly they said, "You're wearing out our painting." At least that was John Bowman's idea. John Moriarty. John Bowman said that. Oh, wait, who? You didn't direct?
I directed the original production.
Right. But that's...
we didn't do the same.
You didn't... Oh, so Moriarty... Well, you're credited.
Whatever.
Take it, it's a good idea.